Good evening and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. My name is Bhante Suddhaso, and this evening I'll be giving a short talk on three kinds of dukkha. So first we can begin by paying homage to the Buddha, and then I'll give a short Dhamma talk and take any questions that you might have. So we can begin with the homage. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So as mentioned, I'll be speaking a bit about the three kinds of dukkha. So this comes from a sutta in the Samyutta Nikaya, from the Magga Samyutta, which is a series of discourses on the Noble Eightfold Path, which is why it's called the Magga Samyutta, the Path chapter. And this is sutta number 165 from the Magga Samyutta. And it's called the Dukkha Sutta. And it's a very short discourse, so I'll just read the whole thing for you. It's not a particularly long discourse. So the discourse begins with the Buddha saying, "Tisso ema bhikkhave dukkha." So he's saying there are these three kinds of dukkha. And interestingly enough here, instead of just using the word dukkha, the Buddha is using the word dukkata. So the suffix ta means the quality of something or the abstract characteristic of something. So it's very similar to the English suffix ness, such as hardness or softness. That suffix ness, N-E-S-S, is very similar to the Pali suffix ta. So dukkha by itself means unsatisfactory or unpleasant or discomfort or unease. So then dukkata means unsatisfactoriness or uneasiness or displeasing. So it has that, it's referring to the quality or aspect of unsatisfactoriness, the quality or aspect of being unsatisfying or displeasing or uncomfortable. So tisso ema bhikkhave dukkata. So amongst there are these three kinds of unsatisfactoriness or the three kinds of discomfort. It says katama tisso, what three? So dukkha dukkata, sankhara dukkata, viparinama dukkata, emako bhikkhave tisso dukkata. So he's saying these are the three kinds of dukkata, of unsatisfactoriness, three varieties of the dukkha experience or dukkha aspect. So dukkha dukkata is the first one. So dukkha dukkata means the unsatisfactory quality of something being painful or unpleasant. So this is the dukkha vedana. So we talk about three kinds of vedana. So sukha vedana, which is pleasant feeling, pleasant sensations. Dukkha vedana, which is painful sensations, unpleasant sensations. And adukkha sukha vedana, so neither painful nor pleasant, a neutral sensation. So of these three, then dukkha vedana is, again, painful sensations. So for example, if you eat food that you don't like, food that you find displeasing, or if you're feeling sick, maybe your stomach hurts or your head hurts, then those are examples of dukkha vedana. Or if you're having a unpleasant emotional experience, maybe you're feeling sad or anxious, those would also be examples of dukkha vedana. Those would be mental vedana, mental sensations. So then dukkha, dukkata, this is the most simple and straightforward of the three kinds of dukkha. And we can understand it very simply, like when we're eating food that isn't cooked correctly or isn't made very well, then it's dukkha. It's unpleasant. Or if you step on a sharp object, then it's dukkha. We can understand these. Or if your friend says something mean to you, it's dukkha. This is the most simple and straightforward form of dukkha. The difficulty is that when we relate only to dukkha in this most simple way, then we might start to think that the other two kinds of Vedana, so Sukha Vedana, pleasant sensation, and Adukkha Sukha Vedana, so neutral sensation, we might think that those don't have the characteristic of dukkha. And it's true that they're not dukkha Vedana in the sense that they're not blatantly painful or displeasing sensations. But they do have the other two kinds of dukkha, the other two characteristics or aspects of dukkha. So again, the word dukkata, meaning that the aspect of dukkha, the characteristic of having, of dukkha, of being subject to dukkha, being a source of dukkha, a way that dukkha can arise. So the second kind is sankhara dukkata. So sankhara is a word which literally it means construct, constructed, or concocted. So it's from the prefix sang, which means together, which is almost identical to the English suffix kon. And it's from the verb kara, which means to build or construct or put together or make or do. So sankhara then literally means to construct, to concoct, to mix together or compile or build up into something. And in the Buddha's explanations of reality, he uses the word sankhara in two primary ways. So one way he uses the word sankhara is in terms of the five khandhas, the five components of personal existence, in which there's rupa, which is our physical body, vedana, which is the experience of pleasant, painful, and neutral, as I mentioned a moment ago, sanya, which is the experience of recognition or identification of experiences, and sankhara, which is mental activities, mental processes, mental objects, mental formations. And then finally, vijnana, which is the experience of consciousness or awareness. So within this scheme of understanding body and mind, then sankhara has the particular meaning of mental constructs and activities, as distinct from vedana, sanya, and vijnana. So as distinct from the pleasant, painful, neutral sensation, from the perceptual identification process, and from the overall experience of consciousness or sensory awareness. So sankhara then would include things like memories and thoughts and mental activities of more coarse and substantial or complex forms than the other three. But the other way that the Buddha uses the word sankhara is in an extremely broad sense. So sankhara again means a construct. So the Buddha uses the word sankhara to mean any distinct object or any distinct phenomenon, any distinct process. So sankhara actually can be translated into English quite simply as thing. So a sankhara is a thing. So any distinct thing can be called a sankhara. So the process of hearing, for example, hearing is a sankhara. Also the sound that one hears is a sankhara. The mind which is listening to the sound is a sankhara. So each one of these is itself a distinct identifiable object or process or thing. So it's a sankhara. And so every single thing within the entire scope of reality is a sankhara, except for nibbana. So nibbana, the element of the absolute reality, which underlies all things. The Nibbana Dhatu, when we talk about it in this way, the underlying absolute reality, is the only thing which the Buddha says is not a sankhara. It cannot be defined as something, as a distinct construct. The Buddha described the Nibbana Dhatu as asankhata, so non-constructed, non-concocted, non-compiled. Whereas everything else is compiled of multiple characteristics put together in order to describe a particular distinct phenomenon. So then you might be wondering, well, what the heck does that have to do with dukkha? Well, the thing with sankharas is that they are constructed, they're constructed objects, which means they have no inherent existence. They have no real substance to them. So an example of this is when I was a child, I used to play with Legos. I don't know if they're still popular these days or not, but when I was young, there were these toys called Legos where you had all these little building blocks of different shapes and sizes, which were designed to interlock and fit together. And so you could take a few hundred Lego blocks and you could assemble them into almost any imaginable shape. Or you could make scenes. You could arrange little Lego people and little Lego landscapes and Lego buildings, and you could arrange all of it into creating some kind of distinct world. Or you could arrange them into distinct objects. So you could make a building, or you could make a ship, or you could make an airplane, or you could make a person, or you could make whatever you want. And then when you were done with that, then you could deconstruct it. You could render it back down into those basic building blocks and then build something else. And then you can deconstruct that and then construct something else, and then deconstruct that and construct something else. So on the one hand, then you can say that the advantage of Legos is that they can be made into absolutely anything. And that's true. Very flexible, very useful. This is not an advertisement for Legos, by the way, just to be clear. So anyway, so it's true. They can be built into anything. They can be compiled into anything. That's true. But that also means that anything you put together from them, it's not quite real. So you put it together easily, but you can deconstruct it just as easily. Except every once in a rare while, the Legos would get stuck together into awkward things that were hard to disassemble. But usually, you could deconstruct them just as easily as you construct them. And actually, when you pay close attention, you can recognize that any Lego construct is not a single object, but rather it's made up of a bunch of small individual components fit together. So anything you make with Legos always tends to look a little bit fake. There's something not quite real about it. If you pay close enough attention, you can see that it's not real. It's artificial. So this is sankhara dukkha. When we pay attention to anything in our experience, we recognize that it's made up of a bunch of individual building blocks, which are not inherently that object itself. So for example, our body. What is our body made up of? It's made up of a bunch of, well, on a coarser level, we can see hair and skin and eyeballs and teeth and fingernails and so distinct coarse things like that. And of course, underneath the skin, you can see muscles and tendons and bones and blood and urine and stomach fluids and all those things. So is stomach fluid, is that the body? No. Saliva, is saliva the body? Hair, is hair the body? Not really. If you trim your fingernails and then you look at the fingernails, do you think that's my body? That those fingernails are a perfect representation of your body? Not really. If you're feeling sick and you vomit, do you then look at the stomach fluids and think, oh, that's my body there? Not really. So then looking at the body, we see that it's made up of all of these distinct building blocks, none of which is itself the body. And of course, when we look more closely, you can see that each bit of the body can also be looked at in smaller ways. You can talk about cells. So we have skin cells, and we have bone cells, and we have muscle cells, and so on. You can look even smaller, and you can look at molecules and atoms and subatomic particles and so on. So you can get very small if you want. And actually, the smaller you look, the more you find that there's just all these little basic building blocks which can be assembled into anything. So the molecules which make up our body are the same molecules which make up the oceans, the same molecules which make up the trees, the same molecules which make up the stars. So it's all just the same basic physical building blocks that can be rearranged and reassembled into any particular shape. So what is this body? There's not really any substance here. You could disassemble it and then build it up into something else, and it would be unrecognizable. In fact, that's what happens when the body dies. When the body dies, it disintegrates, and all the bits and pieces of the body wind up getting mixed back in with nature and used to build other things. Used to build maybe trees and vegetables, and eventually becomes the bodies of animals or humans or something. So there's not really anything here, and it gets scattered and dispersed. So maybe after this body dies, then in a few years, all the molecules of this body, there'll be bits of it in 100 or 1,000 different beings or objects. So then what is this body? There's not really anything of substance here. There's not really anything identifiable. All we can really find is this collection of impersonal building blocks, none of which can actually be properly called my body. They're just impersonal building blocks. So then everything in reality has this kind of artificial, fake feeling to it. A little bit like when, like using a plastic fork instead of a metal fork. It's just kind of crappy, kind of sucky, kind of like, not so great. Or like using plastic chopsticks instead of wooden chopsticks. You're just kind of like, not so great. Or when you get fast food instead of like a good high quality home cooked meal or something from a really top 5-star restaurant, you get like a $2 fast food, and you're just like, not really that great. It's kind of fake feeling, kind of plasticky. So this is our experience of sankhara dukkha, is when we pay attention to our experience, we recognize that it's artificial. It's kind of like a cheap plastic imitation of something. It's kind of like a low quality ripoff of something. And so we're expecting reality to be 5 stars, but when you look closely, it's this cheap plastic imitation, like mass-produced in a very poor way. And actually, when we pay attention to the body, we also recognize that it's constantly decomposing, which also is not a particularly pleasant thing. Which kind of edges into the third kind of dukkha, so viparinama dukkha. So viparinama, by itself, the word viparinama literally just means changing or alteration. But in the suttas, the word viparinama usually has the more precise meaning of a catastrophic alteration or a disastrous alteration, so a change for the worse. An example of this is that the word viparinama in the suttas, it's often used as a word to indicate serious illness or death. There's one case where the Buddha is talking to parents, and he asked them, what if there was some viparinama with your children? How would you feel? And the parents are like, oh, that would be terrible. We would be grief-stricken. We would be unable to eat, unable to sleep. We'd be very depressed, very sad. So there, viparinama, it doesn't just mean change in the sense of say, deciding to have lettuce instead of arugula. Like it's not change in that sense, but it's change in like getting diagnosed with cancer, or change in like beginning to die. So it's a really serious negative alteration. So again, the basic meaning of viparinama does just mean change or alteration, but usually it has a very negative connotation of a disastrous or catastrophic or unpleasant change. So viparinama dukkha, again, the basic meaning of this is the dukkha of things changing. So what tends to happen is that most people will try to create a sense of security and reliability and predictability in their life. So they want to be able to reasonably expect that when they go back to their house, that there's still a house there. They want to reasonably expect that when they get in their car, that their car will start. They want to reasonably expect that their spouse will be still alive and well when they get home. They want to reasonably expect that the food they liked yesterday, they'll still like today, and so on. So people tend to like reliability, predictability, and stability. Now, this isn't true for everyone. Some people actually find reliability and predictability boring. They're not interested in that sort of thing. But generally speaking, the majority of people like reliability and stability. And actually, even people who say that they like unpredictability, again, they're usually pretty specific about what they like to be unpredictable. For example, if they wake up one day and they can't walk because their legs don't function anymore, and they can't eat because their stomach doesn't function anymore, and they can't think straight because their brain isn't functioning anymore, well, realistically, they're not going to be very happy about that, because that's viparinama. That's change in a disastrous way. So again, change can sometimes produce pleasant results. For example, maybe your friend who used to be very irritable starts to do a lot of loving kindness meditation and becomes actually quite pleasant. You're like, oh, how lovely. That's a pleasant change. But often change is actually very unpleasant. Again, like when our parents get old and die, or when our own body, we discover our own body isn't as healthy and strong as it used to be. Our mind isn't as clear as it used to be. Again, we used to really enjoy a particular food and now we can't get it anymore. Or we do get it and it's just not as good as we seem to remember it was. So this is viparinama dukkha. There's nothing reliable in the world. Everything is subject to change, and it's subject also to change for the worse. So this is the characteristic of viparinama dukkha. Things are subject to change, and to change in ways which we dislike or find unpleasing. And so then the Buddha then carries on with the sutta. He says, Imasanko bhikkhve tissanang dukkhatanang. So of these three kinds of dukkha characteristic, these three experiences of unsatisfactoriness, he says, abhinyaya, parinyaya, parikayaya, pahanayaya. So for the higher understanding of these things, for the abhinya, the higher knowledge of these things, for the parinya, the complete knowledge of these things, parikaya, for the complete elimination of these three kinds of dukkha, pahanaya, for the discarding of these three kinds of dukkha. Then he says, the Aryo Atangiko Mago Bhave Tabo. So the Noble Eightfold Path is to be developed. And of course, the Noble Eightfold Path is Samma Ditti, Samma Sankappo, Samma Vacha, etc. So right view, right attitude, right speech. Right view, right attitude, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. So this is our basic roadmap of how we can practice in order first to completely understand these three varieties of dukkha, and also to eliminate them completely from our experience, to discard them completely, to overcome them completely. So again, it's through the practicing of exactly this Noble Eightfold Path. So that's a summary of the three kinds of dukkha. So based upon this particular sutta, again, the Dukkha Sutta from the Magga Samyutta. So at this time, if there's any questions, I'll be happy to take questions. So hello to all the people joining in this evening. So hello to Rick, Ron, Karen, Bhumika, Sud, Richard, Avis, Manal, Henry, Olga, Yankee, Joseph, Jayanta, Antonia, Suma, Gayatri, Scott, Mary, Yenmin Tun, Vivian, Fernando, and everyone else who's joining in. It's wonderful to see all of you joining in. It's really delightful. And I see a few questions. So the first question here, Sud says, so knowing intellectually that sankharas and their change in them is causing us suffering, why does the mind continue to incline towards its tendencies and attachment to money, people, etc.? Well, basically, it's because we don't know a higher happiness. So until one's Buddhist practice, and especially one's meditation practice, gets past a certain point of development, then we think that happiness is to be found through sankharas. So we're always seeking happiness in money and people, as you mentioned. We're seeking happiness in entertainment. We're seeking happiness in sensuality, food, sex, intoxicants, and so on. Because that's what we think is the way to be happy. It's how we get through our life, is by ingesting certain amounts of pleasant experiences in order to make life tolerable. And so until one's spiritual practice gets past a certain point, we're going to keep continuously returning to these inferior forms of pleasure, because that's all we know. It's all we have. So even once we start to recognize that those forms of pleasure are unreliable and ultimately unsatisfying, we'll still keep going back to them because it's all we've got. But once our spiritual practice starts to take off, then we start to get in touch with a higher happiness, a more refined form of happiness, a more refined form of pleasure and joy. And then naturally we start to have less interest in these more coarse, unreliable forms of pleasure. But that can take a while. So be patient with yourself in the meantime. It does take a while. And even once we start to get in touch with higher forms of happiness, so the more refined bliss of spiritual development, then we can still have the residual habits of getting involved in the more base, coarse, unrefined forms of pleasure. So even then, it's important to, again, be gentle and patient with ourselves and give ourselves the time and opportunity to rehabituate the mind towards an appreciation of these more refined forms of happiness. And Richard asks, so the underlying construction of the sankharas serve as the foundation for the misconceptions of me and mine, which creates even more dukkha. Yeah. So basically what happens is, again, we construct this body-mind out of a bunch of individual components, and then we think this is me, this is mine, this is who I am. And as it goes through its changes, we keep continuously identifying whatever the current compilation of components, we keep identifying it as me, as mine. So again, we're not recognizing that it's just a pile of sankharas, which are all just impersonal aspects of nature, nothing which can be really identified as distinctly me or mine. And then again, we create self-identities which are always a little bit out of harmony with our actual experience. And as our experience changes, then our self-identities become increasingly disharmonious with our actual experience. And that generates even more dukkha. And also we have to periodically update our self-identities, which creates even more dukkha. So it's just until we finally start to recognize these three kinds of dukkha, and again, especially sankhara dukkha, as you're pointing out, then we're going to be constantly experiencing this sense of dissonance, of disconnect, disharmony with reality. And Joseph says, how would you describe the enlightenment experience using Legos? Well, first off, it's a little bit risky for me to start talking about full enlightenment because I still have quite a ways to go. But briefly speaking, again, the first step is recognizing that what we call me and mine, so this body mind, it's built up of a bunch of Legos, none of which is actually me or mine. They're just aspects of nature. And that everybody else is built up of exactly the same pile of Legos. And every single thing we encounter is built up of the same pile of Legos. And the Legos themselves are mirages. The Legos themselves are illusory. They're fake. They're not real. There's not really anything there. So it's like a magician's trick. It's like a flash of lightning. It's like a dewdrop. It's like a bubble. There's not really anything here. So eventually we recognize that not only are we made up of exactly the same Legos as everything else, but also those Legos are constantly getting shuffled around, and the Legos are also illusory. So at some point, we stop identifying as any one particular pile of Legos, I suppose. But of course, it's dangerous to overextend metaphors. I actually haven't used the Lego metaphor before, so I haven't thought too deeply about how to use it to describe the enlightenment process. But that's what comes to mind off the top of my head. And Scott says, I find happiness in caring and being interested in the well-being of others. How does this fit in? So those are examples of wholesome sankharas, so kusala sankhara. And those wholesome sankharas will help you progress towards awakening. So actually the Noble Eightfold Path itself is a sankhara, but it's a sankhara which leads towards realizing the asankata dhatu, the element of the unconditioned, the element which is beyond sankharas. And that's the last question. So if there's no other questions, we can go ahead and end the session at this point. So I don't see anything else. So at this time, we can end with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you all next time.